This is part 1 of Unit 4 in a course on key principles on brain health. And we're looking at how to resolve everyday problems like anxiety and stress-related symptoms, sleep problems, mood problems and fatigue by addressing underlying causal factors at the level of biology. And though we're not necessarily talking about medical conditions, we're focusing on a method called functional medicine, which is a tool for coming up with personalized solution plans based on investigating underlying causes. Unit 4 is in 2 parts. In this part we'll look at the stress response and the biological systems that mediate it, and especially the adrenal glands. And then in the second part we'll look at other hormone systems including the thyroid and vitamin D, which is technically not a hormone, but it functions like a hormone because it's essentially a signaling molecule. And then we'll take a closer look at appetite regulation. And it's quite common that appetite regulation is not working too well, especially when you're trying to lose weight. The functional medicine method is based on an analysis at 3 levels. At the top we've got symptoms, anxiety, insomnia, fatigue, etc. And then we're asking questions about the functioning of the body systems that underlie those symptoms. So the idea is that symptoms are manifestations of non-optimal functioning in body systems. And we're using functional lab tests to find out which systems are imbalanced or not working as well as they could, because that gives us targets for interventions. We're looking for the places where we can make the most difference. Ideally, we're looking for the ongoing primary causes, both in terms of what's missing that the body needs and what's present that is causing harm. These are the main body systems we're interested in, the most relevant system to look at. Obviously we're interested in the brain, but brain performance can be impacted by problems elsewhere, as we've been seeing so far through the course. And in this part we're zooming in on the adrenal glands especially, which produce lots of different hormones, including stress hormones. Adrenaline is the one that everybody knows about, but probably not actually the most significant one. So what is stress? It's one of those words that's in common usage, but it's actually quite hard to pin down exactly what it means, but everybody sort of knows what it is. So what I'm saying is that it's something to do with the feeling of being out of your comfort zone, so a kind of emotional discomfort because you've been challenged in some sense. But in science, the word stress has a more precise meaning. And it's any challenge that demands a physiological adaptation or a coping response. And that includes things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as stressful. For example, doing a serious workout in the gym is demanding on your body, so it is a stressor. So is going out in the cold or being cold. Or catching cold for that matter, catching an infection, and not sleeping well is another example. The point here is that we're all under some sort of stress these days, even if you don't think of it as stress, even if it doesn't particularly feel like stress, because there are things that are happening that are stimulating the adrenal glands to produce a physiological response that helps you cope with those challenges. And a certain amount of stress is a good thing, and the stress response itself is a good thing because it helps you to meet the challenge. It's just that too much stress or constant stress can be damaging. The term stress was first used in biology by a Hungarian researcher called Hans Selye back in the 1930s, and he found that, at least to some extent, the body's response to stress is quite generalized, meaning that different contexts can provoke the same sort of response at a biological level. So being chased by the saber-toothed tiger is not that different from going on a roller coaster, at least as far as the adrenal glands are concerned. The stress response is also called the fight or flight response, and that gives some idea of what it's about. It's designed to prepare you for action, and it's something that's evolved to give you the best chance of surviving, for example, being attacked by a predator. Obviously there's a matter of degree, so having to do a presentation at work is not quite the same thing as being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, at least for most people, but both can produce some adrenaline. Which is interesting because modern stressors don't really demand any physical action, at least not the kind of thing that you could call fight or flight. So the stress response is preparing you for something that never comes. So to an extent that makes it maladaptive. Now what does make a difference is the time nature of the stressor. The stress systems really evolved to deal with mainly sort of short, sharp shocks, like predator attacks. But things like worrying about paying your mortgage, or not getting on with your boss at work, or worrying about your teenage son's drug use, they don't fit that pattern. They're much more ongoing, maybe lower level, but of a more constant nature. And it's this kind of stress, this low level constant stress, that seems to be particularly damaging from a health perspective. So in the stress response, the brain sends messages to the rest of the body to prepare for action. And the messages are carried in two ways. Firstly by hormones, and adrenaline is the best known example, and we know that it gives us a rush of energy. And secondly via nerves, and particularly by nerves of the autonomic nervous system. Now, this is a largely involuntary part of the nervous system, and it's got two branches. They're called sympathetic and parasympathetic. These work like the accelerator and brake in terms of the body's arousal level. So the sympathetic mediates fight or flight, so it's the body's way of preparing for action. And there's a level of redundancy in the body, so it's doing the same kind of thing as the hormones. So that's useful for the body to have that redundancy, so that if there are problems in one system, then the other can sort of back it up. Now it turns out in fact that it's the sympathetic nervous system that actually stimulates the adrenal glands to produce adrenaline. So there is a lot of overlap and interaction. The parasympathetic nervous system calms us down again, so it's a mediator of the relaxation response. The adrenal glands produce lots of different hormones, and here we're looking at an important class called glucocorticoids. Adrenaline is not actually in this class, but we have got cortisol, which is another stress hormone and a particularly important one. And in some ways it's like cortisol is like a longer acting version of adrenaline. So like adrenaline, it gives you some energy that will help you cope with stress. But while adrenaline only lasts for a matter of minutes in the system, cortisol stays around for at least some hours. And this diagram is showing the chemical pathways involved. So all the hormones are derived from each other chemically. And we've got some that are well-known ones. We've got the sex hormones, progesterone and testosterone and estrogen. So they're not just produced by the testes and ovaries. Again, we've got some redundancy in the system. And we've also got DHEA, which is, though it's not that well known a hormone, is in fact it's the most abundant hormone in the body. And its functions it's rather vague and general, but it's associated with well-being and also with aging. And it's been dubbed the youth hormone because you produce it at your highest levels when you're in your 20s, and then it starts to drop through your 30s, so that by the time you're in your 80s, it might be as low as 10 or 15% of its former levels. So it's been speculated that this drop over the decades is connected with the loss of vitality that's associated with aging. So the point is that you don't want to lose too much of DHEA, at least not too fast. Now we've got another one, pregnenolone, another less well-known hormone, but important because it's at the top of the tree in the sense that all the other hormones are derived from this one, and it's a powerful hormone in the brain. There's research showing that it works as a powerful antidepressant, for example. Notice as well that it's derived chemically from cholesterol. Now that gives us a hint that cholesterol is not really quite the sort of public enemy that it's often made out to be. The adrenals are ultimately controlled by the brain. In a sense, the brain is a kind of master gland controlling all the others. And a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. It's a very small part of the brain, but it's kind of the brain's interface to the rest of the body. And it has a role both in sensing the state of the body and also on the output side in sending signals that adjust body processes. And we can see that it signals another gland called the pituitary, which is actually just below the brain. And then in turn the pituitary releases hormones that signal to the adrenals, for example to produce more cortisol. Cortisol is then detected in the brain, and that modulates the messages being sent down again, so we have a kind of a feedback control loop. The whole system here is called the HPA axis. That's for hypothalamus, pituitary and adrenals. Now commonly problems with the adrenals are not actually problems with the adrenals themselves, but are the result of a kind of breakdown of the feedback loop or loss of communication. So rather than a damage to the glands themselves, they're a sort of a breakdown in communication. So what exactly can go wrong with the stress systems? Well, different things depending on the stage of stress that you're at. Hans Selye first delineated different stages of the stress response in his work in animals, but the same thing applies to humans. And the first thing to say is that when the system is working well, in other words, when it's adaptive, you get sort of bursts of stress response as needed, and then you recover quite quickly. So you get a burst of cortisol, and then over a period of perhaps a few hours, your cortisol level goes back to normal, and that's all working and there's no problem. But when stress becomes constant, then you can get chronically high levels of cortisol, which go with sort of chronically high arousal. Now that might or might not feel bad. You might feel anxious, you might feel wired or tired, or you might actually have a sort of a buzz of energy that you quite enjoy. But the point is, it's not doing you any good in your system, because cortisol is designed for the short term, and in fact when it's persistently around, it can start doing damage, for example to brain cells. So chronically high cortisol is quite common in depression, and it's one of the many possible causal factors of depression. Now other hormones may be starting to drop low at this point because of a process called pregnenolone steal. And that just means that the body is diverting its resources towards cortisol, which is kind of most needed, perhaps at the expense of other hormones like DHEA. Now if you carry on long enough in that stage of chronic arousal, and you can hit the stage of burnout or exhaustion. In this stage, cortisol levels drop low. Now again, I want to stress that it's not really the glands themselves that have burned out, but the stress system as a whole. And it's like the body has worked out that it's not good to be in the state of high cortisol levels. Now you can get diseases of the adrenal glands where hormone production goes really low, and that's a medical condition. Quite rare actually, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm referring to a condition that's sometimes called adrenal fatigue. And the point is, it's a stress condition, not a medical disorder. Now a lot of doctors will tell you that there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue, but what they really mean is that it's not a medical disorder. So in the burnout stage, you generally feel tired, at least for part of the time, and especially maybe mid to late afternoon. You may feel wired as well, or anxious, and in fact you can have low stress tolerance, because remember that cortisol helps you cope with stress. So at this stage it seems like little things can upset you beyond reason. And in fact it's not that easy to tell the stages apart by symptoms alone, because you can get both of these feelings of tired and wired in either stage. So it's one of the good reasons that it's worth getting a test of the adrenal functions done. Now, another thing that can go wrong is that you can lose the natural rhythm of cortisol. So ordinarily, cortisol peaks in the morning at around the time that you'd wake up. And in fact, it's quite an important part of waking up and feeling energized at that point. And then cortisol drops steadily over the course of the day, and in fact into the night, and starts to rise again, maybe something like 4, 5, 6 a.m., so that it peaks again maybe 8 a.m. when it's time to get up again. So this rhythm can get lost or dysregulated. And sometimes you see that cortisol rises in the evening, and that's usually a cue for sleep problems. So disordered sleep patterns, that's another quite common symptom of adrenal dysregulation in one way or another. It could be that there are sleep onset problems due to high cortisol in the evening. Or another common form is early waking, maybe 4 or 5 a.m. and you're awake at that point. You can't get back off to sleep again until it's sort of 7 or 8 when it's actually time to get up again, at which point you start to feel really tired again. By the way, it's perhaps worth saying that you can find out more about the symptoms of adrenal dysregulation via the questionnaires that I have on the website. That early waking pattern may be associated with hypoglycemia, which we first met in the last part of the course on blood sugar regulation. So hypoglycemia is a state of low blood sugar and resultant slump in energy and drive. That's often relieved when you eat more carbohydrates. Now the point here is that if you can't produce enough cortisol, you're going to be prone to this state, because cortisol is, in practice, it's the most important hormone for raising your blood sugar back up again when it's dipped low. So a prevalence of hypoglycemic slumps is a common sign of the burnout stage of adrenal dysregulation. So, of course, it's a good idea to test the status of the stress response. If the stress response is dysregulated or out of balance, you want to know what stage you're at, what exactly is going on, so that you can make the appropriate interventions that are targeted to your personal needs. For example, if you have low cortisol, you can take measures to raise it, but if you're in the chronic arousal stage, then these same measures aren't going to be helpful. In fact, they may even make things worse. And there are different ways to assess the stress response. First, you can have a look at the adrenal hormones, most notably cortisol and DHEA. Another lab test that gives a general impression of the stress response is hair mineral analysis. And an assessment that you can do at home using inexpensive equipment is heart rate variability, or HRV analysis. That's going to tell you something about the autonomic nervous system balance. In a moment, I'm going to explain adrenal testing in more depth. I won't actually say anything more about HRV assessment, but there are some references in the additional materials section that you can follow up. Now, before I talk about adrenal testing, let me summarize the conventional understanding of the adrenal stress response and the stages of dysregulation. I've described 3 patterns. First, chronic arousal, where cortisol is consistently too high. In this stage, you tend to feel wired, unable to switch off. Maybe you feel tired at the same time. Second, there's the burnout or exhaustion stage, where cortisol drops low and you tend to feel tired and burnt out. Then there's loss of daily cortisol rhythm, which also tends to mess up your energy levels. So I think these basic categories make a lot of sense, and it would be nice if everyone neatly fell into one or the other of the 3, but I'm afraid reality tends to be rather less clear-cut. So now I'm going to complicate the picture. This is unfortunately necessary for you to properly understand hormone testing. Hormones can exist in 2 forms. First, the free or active form, and second, the inactive or bound form. This is a kind of storage form. And this applies to both cortisol and DHEA. As you might expect, it's the levels of the free or active forms that mainly determine how you feel, but at the same time, we can't ignore levels of the storage form. So when it comes to assessing the adrenal hormones, the requirements are these. First, we want to have a look at both cortisol and DHEA. They're both relevant to the stress response, And in some ways, the balance between the two is the most important factor. Second, we want to know levels of both active and inactive forms. In fact, the inactive or storage forms represent the large part of the total hormone levels. So knowing the inactive levels gives you an indication of hormone production. It's actually not uncommon to have a good healthy production of adrenal hormones at the same time as having low levels of active hormones. In that case, you would not want to attempt to boost hormone production as you would if there were low levels of both active and inactive. So you can start to see why it's important to know the full picture. The third requirement of adrenal hormone testing is to assess the daily cortisol rhythm. In practice, what this means is that you need to take multiple samples over the course of a full day. It's typically 4, first thing in the morning, last thing before bed, and then 2 more in between. You can test adrenal hormone levels in blood, or in saliva, or in urine. So which is best? Blood tends to be used for medical tests of adrenal function. Blood tests usually report the total amount of hormones, but remember, we're not really interested in the medical status of the adrenal glands. We want to assess the stress response, which is something quite different. And an obvious problem with blood tests is that it's not easy or convenient to collect 4 samples over the course of a day. By contrast, it's much easier to collect saliva samples. Most commercially available functional adrenal tests use saliva samples, but the weakness of using saliva is that it only gives you the active or the free cortisol, which is not the whole picture. Urine offers the best prospects because you can get an indication of both total hormone production and the free or active hormone. At the same time, it's convenient to take 4 samples over the course of the day, thus giving you the cortisol rhythm. The lab that I work with uses dried urine samples. These have the advantage of being stable and easy to send by post. There's no great need for speed in transporting the samples back to the laboratory. Okay, moving on to hair mineral analysis. This test is quite a general functional health assessment tool. It looks at quite a large number of minerals in hair, which is of course an actual body tissue. So it's not specifically an adrenal test, but it can tell us quite a lot about the adrenal stress response, at least indirectly. The hair mineral test includes the so-called macrominerals, which are the most abundant minerals in the body, and they are calcium, magnesium, sodium and potassium. Now, the balance of these minerals is regulated by the adrenal glands, and in particular by a hormone called aldosterone. In hair, the relative levels of these 4 minerals reflects what stage of the stress response you're at. In the stage of chronic arousal, or high cortisol, you'd expect to see sodium and potassium high, as you do here, while in the exhaustion stage, sodium and potassium tend to drop low, while calcium rises up, maybe off the scale, and sometimes magnesium does too. So the test is telling you not so much about how much you've consumed, but how the body is holding on to these minerals, which depends on your adrenal function. The test is also useful in that the hair sample you send represents a few weeks' growth, so it gives you a sort of time averaged picture rather than a snapshot as most lab tests do. So let's finish by summarizing what we've learned in this module. The stress response is to some extent a generalized response, and it can be the same even in situations that you wouldn't particularly feel as stressful, like a gym session, say. Stress is mediated via hormones, and especially adrenal hormones, but also via the autonomic nervous system. The time nature of the stressor matters. Low-level constant stress and worrying seem to be particularly damaging to health. Dysregulation can take particular forms. We've looked at chronic overarousal, where cortisol goes chronically high and causes problems such as anxiety, and the burnout stage, or adrenal fatigue, where cortisol and other hormones drop too low, typically leading to fatigue and brain fog. You can lose the daily rhythm of cortisol. This often feels the worst in terms of symptoms. It may be an intermediate stage before exhaustion. I'd say that for most people with the kind of problems that I work with, that is fatigue, anxiety and poor stress tolerance, low mood, brain fog, weight gain and appetite dysregulation, Most of these people have some level of adrenal dysregulation. Lastly, it's a good idea to test adrenal function so that you can tailor your intervention in a way that's appropriate to your stage of stress. In part 2 of Unit 4, we'll take a look at other hormones.